National Museums Scotland, and he'll be giving his paper Material Histories of Knowledge in Transit in Museum Settings.
Much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see the screen now? Yeah, super. So thank you so much. My name is Geoff Belknap. Wish we could be there with you today, but our carbon restrictions don't allow us or limit how much we can travel these days, which is only a good thing, but we wish you could be there to be in person. What we're going to do is a joint talk today where we're going to talk through the consequences and potentials of theories such as knowledge in transit in museum settings. I'm a historian of science, trained in history of science methodologies, particularly working with Jim and embedding myself in knowledge in transit concepts, who then later in his career moved into museum and museum practice now as a keeper for science and technology. My colleague here, George Grant, comes from a very different perspective, working first in kind of museum studies and then directly in museum practice before coming to a science and technology collection, particularly in working around history of science concepts. So we're going to really look in this paper at how concepts proposed 20 years ago about how information travels is reflected or is not reflected in museum collections and practice. Briefly, let me just describe the kind of case studies we're going to be focusing on, which is centered around the National Museum Scotland, which we will both work in. If you've not had the joy and pleasure of being in Edinburgh, particularly in August, where the size of the city quadruples, National Museum Scotland is centre into the city, is one of its oldest and longest standing national museums, is a very interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary museum. It started as both a natural science collection from the University of Edinburgh and a science and technology collection in the 1850s. And then over the last 150 years has combined to include ethnology and anthropology collections, art and design collections, and then from 1985 onwards, Scottish antiquary and Scottish archaeology collections. So if there is a universal museum, which we don't claim to be, NMS would certainly have a claim to be that. So we're going to be talking through a couple of examples of how knowledge in transit concepts have filtered in and through our work and our practice in the museums. But just to remind ourselves some of the things that Jim said 20 years ago in ISIS and in this place, he argued, among many things, that the narrative frameworks used by historians of science need to come to terms with the diversity of understanding science as a form of communication. So we are going to look at museum collections that focus on communications collections. This is diverging a little bit from some of the other papers that have focused here, and this is much more centering communications on what a museum might define as communications collections, which asterisks here we understand isn't the full scope of what one might think of as communications methods or of how knowledge transit over space. More particularly, however, Jim focused on three areas for historians of science to address through a knowledge in transit or a KIT perspective. That was a sustained attention to how we research and write about practices of communication, movement, and translation of knowledge, that we needed to broaden our geographical and disciplinary boundaries. And I think this conference has really paid or given key examples of how that's happened over the last 20 years, as well as giving an opportunity to draw together interdisciplinary approaches. So we're not going to focus on all of these areas, but we will speak to particularly the last of these points about the potential and the opportunities for drawing together interdisciplinary approaches. The paper really argues that archives and objects as physical artifacts are absolutely key to the argument here and of knowledge in transit and to history of science. And we can really only uncover knowledge as communication by looking at the archive. The paper looks at the role of storing the records of the past and how this affects how we consider the history of communication technologies more generally. Moreover, it argues that predominantly the archive is understood as a paper one. While history of science has been better than some other disciplines at incorporating object histories into our disciplinary methodologies, we'll be taking the perspective of museum curators, exploring how core objects and stories of knowledge in transit, the telegraph, the telephone, the printing press, and the photograph, are not just evidence of the way information is transmitted and circulated, but they also tell us about the fragility of this history. While history of science has moved to be a more transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary set of methods, the concepts always haven't directly impacted the way museum professionals understand it and work with communications objects in particular. So we'll end with some reflections on how the concepts discussed 20 years ago have been included and excluded from museological practice. So first, I'm going to hand over to George, who's going to tell you about the role of some of the iconic communication objects in the collections at NMS.
Hi, everyone. So as Geoff said, I'm coming at these examples really from a background in museum studies, which means I've got that background of museum practice, knowledge of institutional history, and challenges of working with collections. So with that in mind, these examples will just expand more on what Geoff has been talking about. The first object I'm going to look at, this is a really early example of what the museum collected in terms of what we now classify as communication objects. It's a jointed submarine cable that was donated by its inventor, Maxwell Dick, in 1855. It was the third ever object that came into the museum. At the time, the director, he had a great interest in the Atlantic Telegraph, so it probably came into the collection via his interest. And it was collected within a wider climate of developments to lay submarine cables. This was 5 years after the first submarine cable was laid between Britain and France in 1850, and 3 years before the first transatlantic cable was laid between Ireland and North America in 1858. So this cable was likely a really exciting acquisition within that environment, a symbol of the advances in technology and communication. However, there's very little information about the cable in the museum's documentation. The description in the accession register, it simply reads, jointed submarine telegraph cable invented by the donor. And this is really typical of the time, with not much given in the accession registers beyond very brief descriptions. And you may notice that this image of the cable is simply a blacked out image. This is because the cable is currently unlocated and it's being classified as unlocated in the collection stores for some years. And whilst unusual, it's not uncommon for objects that came into the museum in the early years to now be unlocated. But for such an object that really speaks to communications history, this raises questions of how a museum views objects within its collections and how they are valued. The lack of information about the cable and the fact that it is unlocated, it really reflects early museum practice. And this has vastly changed over the years. We now ensure that we accurately describe objects, what they are, their materials, who the donor was, and we have strict record keeping to document locations of all objects. However, those early years, they really continue to impact our work as we try to unpick the history and the meaning of those objects and retrospectively fill in that information. But it's lengthy and time-consuming work. It takes time to learn and understand a collection, to know where absences and lack of information may lie, and then to have the time to do that research. The collection at the museum, just to give you a sense of scale, which Geoff will talk about a bit in a minute. So the museum has in the region of 12 million objects, and often the knowledge you gain as a curator, it's situated. It's only when you're working in a storeroom surrounded by objects, or if you have a certain project that requires looking at specific items, that you start to understand the collection. And as curators, we have to learn to sit with those absences and acknowledge that collections, they're not whole, nor are they complete. For the submarine cable, which is such an important source of communications technology through which we can tell these stories of circulating knowledge, its loss of information and those wider absences in collections also need to be taken into account in our understanding. Next slide, please, Geoff. Jumping forward a couple of decades, the next object I want to talk about is the box telephone. This strange looking device, it's the first model of telephone to go on sale. It was made in 1877 by Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell. Obviously, it's a very representative communications object, and this one is on display in the museum. But whilst it's an iconic object and is used to explain the history of communications and the developments of transmitting speech, we don't have any of the messages to go alongside it, the conversations it once channeled. And it really highlights that museums, we're good at collecting those tangible histories. And in terms of communications, we've got the objects, the telegraphs, telephones, radios, but not the messages or recordings. But what does that mean for our communications collection and the understanding of communications history if we aren't collecting those messages? There are some developments in museum practice to rectify this, but those are more in line with collecting oral histories. In the UK, the most well-known example of an institution collecting sounds is the British Library, and they've got a large sound archive with over about 3 million sound recordings. But what does this mean for science museums? Again, we've got absences here, and should we look to fill them? Should we be aiming to capture those conversations and recordings? Next slide, please, Geoff. Thank you. This is a Columbian printing press. Again, it's on display in the museum. It's a beautiful press. It's known for its high decoration, and they were enormously popular throughout the 19th century in the UK, as they could print much faster than the earlier wooden presses. You can see it on display here in the Grand Gallery. It's a central part of the museum. So it really signals the importance of this object, not only within our technology collection, but as an icon of communications history. But when it came into the museum, which was in 1865, it wasn't destined for the collection. It was actually bought to be used in the print workshop to print labels for the objects. And it's understandable why the museum would want a Columbian press. They were very good, and operationally speaking, one was needed to print material for the museum itself. But I think what is interesting is that when it came to collecting printing presses in general, the museum didn't acquire its first press until 1923, which is 70 years after the museum had opened and over 400 years after Gutenberg's press was developed. So for 70 years, the curators, they did not collect a single press, despite them being an obvious choice to represent communications history. And whether this was a conscious choice by the curators at the time, it's hard to know, but it does raise questions, particularly as Edinburgh, it was a long established and celebrated centre of printing and publishing. And when it came to this Columbian press, that only came formally into the collection in 1964, so almost 100 years after it had been working in the print shop. This lack of acquiring printing presses until later years, I would say it serves to remind us that when it comes to museums acquiring objects, there can often be blind spots as to what is collected. And this can be for various reasons, such as a curator's bias of what they're interested in, or their knowledge of what should be collected to represent certain subject areas. I should add that museum practice has again developed over the years, and we now have collecting policies which explain what we should or what we should aim to collect. What can remain tricky though, even today, is collecting contemporary items. For the museum in 1865, the Columbian printing press, I think, would have been a good example of current printing practice to collect, but that press wasn't viewed that way. At the museum today, we have a contemporary collecting working group, and they aim to capture the present. And for the science and technology department, that's looking at collecting new technologies and developments in science. But those judgments aren't easy. It's hard to decide on what is going to be important in the future. And acquiring those objects, that's often dependent on relationships we can build with businesses and companies to explain why we might want to collect their objects for the museum. And we also have constraints as well. Most museums have this problem of whether there is space in the storerooms, and that's a particular problem for science and technology objects, which tend to be large and bulky. And there might be issues or challenges around costs as well of either the object itself or transporting it to the museum. So to take these examples and go back to Jim's quote that Geoff mentioned earlier, if Jim suggests that narrative frameworks used by historians of science need to come to terms with diversity by understanding science as a form of communication, what happens when we actually look at these collections, when we aim to tell the history of communications, where there's absences, lack of knowledge or information, there's bias and inconsistent collecting, which, as we argue, suggests a fragility of this history, and that needs to be considered when we look at the history of communications more generally. I'm now going to hand back over to Geoff, who will look at a couple of other examples in our collection.
Thanks, George. So I'm going to speak to a set of collections, or a collection that has a very different problem but sits quite squarely in communications, and that is photographic collections. Communications collections, particularly photographic collections, are problematic for a couple of different reasons. One, they are often considered alongside what others might call paper technologies, in that they are multi-visual and textually inscribed pieces of information with many ways of reading them, as well as almost always being objects of scale. So let's take an example here of the Scottish Life Archive. So this is one of the most important and largest photographic archives in the National Museum of Scotland. It was acquired in the second half of the 20th century by the Scottish History and Archaeology team. Thanks very much. It is a collection which was from 1959, shows a 200-year history of Scotland through an index of photographic images and content. It is gigantic, though. So if you take this object, which is it's Kailascoo Ferry up in Sunderland, this is an index of a photograph within this book that is telling you where this came from and how you can read it. It sits within just one wall here, which is thousands of photographs along these same types of indices. So this is a complicated and problematic, but also very interesting archive to read through, to understand not just communication as a photographic object, but how communication is defined through the Scottish Life Archive itself. One might wonder why ferries are included in a communications collection. However, this isn't the only part of the photographic archive of the Scottish Life Archive. It is quite a complicated and diverse collection. So you can see that in the previous image here, it isn't just a photograph on an index card, it is also associated with a glass negative. So if you were to go 1.5 miles across Edinburgh and to go to our collection center, you would find the glass plate negative and the transparency negative collection that's associated with this. It has images like this that could then have been printed off and put in the index cards and be associated across the whole collection. I just want to point to the issue here, which is one of scale. The photographic collections have been theorized and talked about in Histories of Photography recently by Ella Revelius and Elizabeth Edwards in a recent monograph called What Photographs Do, which are thinking about the consequences of photography within museum settings, but it isn't always thinking across or with histories of science and methodologies such as knowledge and transit concepts, or how information travels across space. It's thinking about institutional practices. And what I want to just point to or gesture to here is that there's potentials and benefits of speaking across the kind of museum way of thinking and history of science way of thinking. And with the last couple of minutes, I just want to point to some of the trajectories over time of history of science and museological thinking, and how these overlap or change. So a focus on objects, as we said before, has been a long history within the histories of science. Particularly, I'm pointing to Rainey Daston's Things That Talk here, which focuses or emerges concepts such as objects biographies and looking at things and their complicated way of understanding them. I think most iconically, our manager, Sam Alberti, wrote one of the, I think, at least for museum studies, iconic articles, Objects in the Museum, which helps us think through object itineraries and focusing on the object and centering the museum. So in Sam's conception, the museum becomes a vessel for the bundle of relationships enacted through each of these thousands. He was looking at natural history specimens on display and in store. So focusing around the museum and institutional practices, which is what we've been showing a little bit here. Other more recent histories that are written by historians of science who are working in, with, and through museums are the work of people like Miriam Drusius, whose work 100 Histories, One Object, which is in direct opposition to Neil MacGregor's concept of the British Museum and its 100 objects telling the history of the British Museum and the British Empire. These kind of histories are particularly and specifically using concepts and theories such as knowledge in transit and communications histories to help understand museum practice and particularly photographic practice. But if you look, again, more broadly at other historians of science and science museum practice, such as this recent volume, Understanding Use, written by probably well-known names here, such as Tim Boone and Klaus Stauben, who used to work at the National Museums of Scotland. The kind of theories and conceptualizations are much more about curators' work, what we do in museums, and focusing on practice, not necessarily looking at how those bridge across space and are put into global context. And finally, I just want to speak to another piece which I think could be quite fruitful for historians of science, and particularly thinking about what museum practitioners do. And that's an article from about 14 years ago by Nicholas Thomas, who's the director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. And he wrote this small piece or commentary called The Museum as Method that helps us think about museum practice as being an opportunity to understand and do away to a certain degree with theory, and think through how museum curators actually do think and work around objects, and how that centers their practice, which is one about interpretation, storytelling, and a focus on things, as Rainey Daston has showed us. But I think more broadly, if you look at museums literature, so museums journals and museological practice, the concepts and theories that we've been talking about for the last couple of days don't necessarily either get cited or talked about, but rather they get focused on through, they don't get focused on in a more fruitful way, which I think could really be beneficial both to museum practice and to history of science. As someone who's been a convert to museological practice from history of science, I speak from experience that I think there is benefit of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary work, but I think there's more work to be doing, to take Jim's point that interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity needs to be taken more to heart. And I guess our point is for historians of science to ask more, what would a curator do? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes for questions. Dr. Grant, I apologize. I didn't introduce you earlier, but thank you for your talk. Questions? Well, maybe I will start with one question. So you've ended on the suggestion that that historians of science would sort of think more like a curator. How do you think that would alter the kinds of the histories that you write, say, about any one of those objects that you show us?
Maybe I can start, George, and then I can hand over to you if you have any thoughts. So I think as I've described, there is already work and methodology to think through and with objects in the histories of science. So I don't think we need to change or do, well, I would always like to see more. In my experience, I would love to see more visual culture-centered practice within history of science. But I think what we're trying to allude to here is that there have been, I think history of science is better than some other disciplines of working in situ in museum practice. So being inserted into curatorial practice. And I think there's more work to be done there, I think, by bringing people into not just working with collections and working through collections, but helping work around other curators to think about the consequences of different ways of methodological thinking, particularly about how either documentation or interpretation centering changes the questions that you ask around an object or the kind of stories that you then tell. So I think what Nicholas Thomas points to in his article is that what curators do is always start with the objects rather than start with an argument or a theory. Obviously, historians always go back to the sources and work with the sources, but it is true that in my experience that when you were starting and looking through a museological frame, the starting point is always different and it leads you to different questions. And I think for knowledge in transit, particularly if we're looking for interdisciplinary and global contexts, it would benefit to do more across the table conversations, as well as more across the table in situ experience. of working in and around collections. But George, I don't know if you want to come in on that as well.
I think you captured everything there. I've got, I'm afraid, nothing else to add.
Yeah. Oh, actually, what?
Okay. My question is for Dr. Brown. I just want to know, you spoke of the history of communications, right? How do you understand the history of communication? I mean, what's the framework?
Sorry, do you mind, could someone repeat that closer to the microphone? I didn't quite catch it.
She asked, you mentioned the history of communications, and she asked, what do you conceive of, like, what's the framework for the history of communications that you're talking about?
That's a good question. I should admit that I'm fairly new to the history of communications. I've been at the museum for 2 years now, and as a technology curator, you get a whole range of categories to look after, and communications is one of that. So that's something I'm still grappling with. And certainly at the museum, at the moment, it's quite defined. So there's categories within communications, and that would cover printing history, telegraphs, radios, TVs, telephones, and to some extent it's the wider association as well. So we have associated trades such as engraving for printing blocks for printers. So that's kind of my point of view, and then it's something that I'm learning as I go along through this.
I think I would add to that, one of the important points of working in and around or working in museum practice is that part of our work is to categorize, is to put things in boxes, because we need to, both for our documentation, as I showed for photography. If we have such a scale of photographs that we need to be able to document and categorize them. And I'm sure Staffan will tell us about Linnaean systems in a minute of categorization, but museums have their own systems of categorization, and communications is, especially for science and technology collections, one of those core collections areas that is defined and bounded. And we mean it by something that is included. It can be expanded to a certain degree, but they are also always defined and rationalized, which is the core bit of curatorial work.
Okay, thank you. I apologize if they don't. Okay, so we'll, because our time is so compressed, thank you very much for your presentation, and we'll move on to the next set of speakers. So we have Staffan Müller.
Yeah.
I'm butchering everybody's name, I apologize.
No problem.
From the University of Cambridge, and Elena Isayev from the University of Exeter, who will be speaking on Linnaeus and Lapland, generating knowledge in transit.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming and joining us here. Okay, yes, so Elena and I have come here to present results from a little project we carried out years ago, and also during COVID, quite interestingly, on a scientific journey, a famous one from 1732, with the basic idea of, in a way, retracking that journey, meeting people, talking about that journey that was carried out 300 years ago, and see what else one can learn about it through that kind of process. So it's a little bit an analogy to reworking experiments, what we were trying to do. Next slide, please. And the journey. Does it?
You have to press there or there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the journey, as you already saw, the title and slide is the journey to Lapland, or actually Laplandic journey, as Linnaeus called it, that Linnaeus carried out in 1732 as a 5-year-old medical student. Quickly about the context of the journey, it was supported by the Royal Society for Sciences in Uppsala. That's not the one in Stockholm, which nowadays is very famous. The Royal Society for Science still exists in Uppsala, but is very small now, quite a charming society. That society was dedicated to the promotion of the wealth of the fatherland. So Linnaeus subscribed to these ideas as well. The journey was also backed by a number of influential mentors. Now, this journey has been looked at so far mainly under two main perspectives. The first one is a rather conventional one, Linnaeus as an explorer. It's already a stereotype that Linnaeus creates himself. He stages himself, as you can see here, as someone who's been to an empty, unknown space and brings back knowledge, not only knowledge, interestingly, but also objects. Also objects that enshrine knowledge, like the Sami drum with drawings on it. Lapland here appears as a terra nullius to be explored and appropriated, and Linnaeus has been in this line celebrated as a pioneer of ethnographic and ecological methods. The second is the second perspective under which this journey has been looked at is that of an agent of early colonialism in the north. Linnaeus was very confident that this science would carry into the future. He submitted this memorandum regarding the cultivation of Lapland with a new kind of cereal after his journey. So this was literally about cultivating Lapland in all sorts of senses. And this would, of course, amount to replacing or even destroying what he otherwise described and exalted as a very healthy, happy culture, the Sami culture, with a different kind of civilizations. In both perspectives, Lapland Lapland and its inhabitants is passive. The agency lies with Linnaeus, or rather the economic and political forces that work through him. Both perspectives are not false, but they judge Linnaeus in hindsight by the long-term effects his journey has had on our present understanding of the North and its inhabitants. And we had a little bit the ambition to develop a different perspective at his travel diary. The travel diary is preserved in the Linnaean Society of London. Why it's in London is a whole different story that is also quite interesting. And we wanted, very much inspired by Jim Seeker's paper, but not, of course, only his paper. But it was an important inspiration. We wanted to look at the making of knowledge through travel and intersections in time, the making of knowledge through communication, that means that we wanted to look at the importance of infrastructures, the media used, and the importance of translation as it was practiced. And one of the topics that really quickly came, moved into the center of our interest was that of hospitability. And that's what we're going to talk about now a little bit. And Lena will start us off on infrastructures.
Okay. There's also a quick thank you from us for the amazing conference and all the people who made it happen, including those sitting here at the sides. Some of you online may not be able to see, as well as some of the main organizers. So coming back to this, so this is a reproduction of the map that Linnaeus himself drew. And what makes it really interesting is you immediately see that there's lots of spots around the actual coastline, and then there's lines going inland. And what those represent are infrastructures. So the infrastructures in terms of when he's around the coast, he's on highways, there are inns, there are priests, there are other people who can host him. And then there are excursions inwards, upwards and westwards, along rivers, and those require guides. And in one instance, he actually says that he goes all the way to the Atlantic coast of Norway, and we're going to come back to that towards the end. So interestingly, when we were looking through his papers, one of the exciting things that appeared in one of the boxes, particularly exciting for me because I work on bordering practices, mobility, migration, displacement, is a pass, or passes and passports, or what we might today equate passports. And these are themselves, of course, a form of infrastructure, less to do with the kind of bordering that we experience today and the kind that would lead to the forced relocations in this region in the 1920s, we'll come back to as well, but rather they were about enhancing and supporting passage. And some of them were in the form of letters of introduction. This one's a little bit different, and it's also quite an interesting one in terms of instantly the kind of things that appear underneath the kind of more general description that Staffan just gave you of the way that Linnaeus perceived of going into this remote landscape. So I'm just going to read you this out. It says, order to all policemen and their deputies in Luxila, Lapmark, to support Linnaeus. All policemen and their deputies within Luxila, Lapmark herewith receive the order to help Mr. Carl Linnaeus if he so demands, with all obligingness. Now just remember that word for a second. In whatever he might need or ask from them, and especially that they either act as his guides themselves wherever he goes, or otherwise use other obliging Laps, I'm going to come back to that term, for that, who can talk Swedish, and it shall be indicated to the other Laps to let him pass through their land and woods freely and without obstruction, which you should set yourself as obedient precept. Camille 1732, as Pagander, who is a sheriff, or executive officer of the crown. So just a very small footnote on the term Laps. That is considered today a derogatory term. It's a Finnish word meaning far away or someone living remotely in the woods, not something the Sami would call themselves. But we're going to refer to Laps when it appears in the text. But this is the current people who live in these lands, and Sapmi are refer to themselves as Sami of different kinds. So the purpose of this is this pass or letter, not quite a letter of introduction, is support, protection, and provision of services, and unimpeded passage. Now, any of you who have a UK passport, or even a Canadian passport, I think does this because it comes from the Crown. The main drive of the first statement on the cover of the passport is unimpeded passage, which is a little bit ironic because passports kind of seem to be implying the opposite of that. But technically, it's around the same kind of thing, and it's coming from the same kind of authority as well. So that's also interesting. But here it's kind of done in real terms rather than just a rhetorical, kind of a rhetorical bureaucratic speak. And it nicely specifically refers to guides to be obliging. And that term is used both for the officials and also for the Sami. So although there are signals of different kinds of jurisdiction, it's interesting what we think of in terms of guides and hospitability when it comes to that kind of infrastructure, which is away from those inns and highways. So there's a recognition of people's presence, if not an ownership of the land. And I realize that that kind of terminology being spoken here in Canada, in Nova Scotia, in light of yesterday's amazingly eye-opening discussion by Albert and also Alan, means a lot of very different things, as it does when you're in Sami. But the land, of course, be differently valued by the Sami, and we find in section 67 of Linnaeus' diary, he tells us a bit about what that means. The property for the Laps, he writes, consists of great numbers of reindeer. Someone has great reindeer power, as they say, and the war stock have 50 to 100, well-off Laps have some 300 to 700, and the rich have 1,000. Their lands are 20 to 35 miles in diameter. So he's getting a territorial kind of value, if you like. He's translating that into territory. Well, the description that we find here is something that's very close to what might be called a SIDA, which is a recognition of a time-space value. So that's the mobile area of the herds under common jurisdiction of a group. And that in itself, that definition, which I've just given you, is also debatable and a bit more complex than that. So what we get in both the past, but also in Linnaeus' writing, is a description of the complex position of people to the land and the sea, and the different status of those who move through it and also those who use it. And the passports, as I've already kind of hinted at, also raise the issue of hospitability. So itself an infrastructure of hospitality. And one of the wonderful things we get also in Linnaeus is a list of hosts. So one of them is, for example, Ola Gran, is the one we highlighted here. Pastor Ola Gran in Luxila, quiet, handsome man, suffered inconvenience for me, both on journey up and down, promoted my journey with great care, delighted me well, and gave me a lap boat in miniature, which cost him carolins. How weird. Put down a price for gifts, but anyway. So what this is, though, is an example of the official hosts posting his notes. They're not just to remember, but also doing self-reflections, and as a reminder to pass on greetings or anything that might be lobbied for as well, as we find out through bits of the diary. So what's missing here? So first of all, these are all men of status. What's missing are women and Sami. Now, these are very much mentioned in the diary. Women, we know from the entries in the diary, were in the kitchens and exchanged their insights about giving birth, cooking, medicinal qualities of certain herbs, and also some of them about Sami knowledge. So one particular person, Christina Brot, who's the wife of Pastor Alstadius in Quickjof, clearly was somebody really important to Linnaeus and that knowledge of bridges as he then went on to his more inland journeys with the Sami as guides. But I want to focus on briefly on one particular woman who he does talk about in a bit more detail. And this is somebody who he refers to as the Furia, or at least at the beginning. And this comes up in his diary when he describes a particularly hard slog through the bog, the wet, the cold, and they are lost in Lapland and Luxila. And he describes this as a place far from civilization, that even the closest Sami had not visited for 20 years, as we see very quickly that becomes untrue. So it's kind of distancing in both time, but also into a historic past place. So it's a bit like if you imagine medieval maps, these are the edges of the medieval maps. This is like where the monsters and dragons live. And out of this edges, or what he refers to almost as the sticks, comes the Furia. And he writes, with him, so with his guide came a person, whether it was a man or a woman, I could not tell. I don't believe that any poet had depicted a fury so precisely as to compete with this one. And of course, the poet is in his head, and we know from other sources, was Ovid's Metamorphoses. So 2,000-year-old myth in his head is what he carries with him in a place of the unknown. So instantly, that's the framework he first looks through on meeting this particular woman, who he calls Fury. And he goes on to describe her as having eyebrows black, her hair pitch black, hanging down around her head, on which there sat a red flat cap. The skin resembled that of a frog. But she wore brass bangles, a belt around her waist, and lap boots on her feet. And then he says, at first I was scared, but then the Fury herself, however, spoke to me gently and with compassion. So this does all of a sudden challenges his stereotype, challenges this myth. And she supposedly said to him, "Oh, you poor man, what harsh circumstances of fate have driven you where no one has ventured hitherto? You know, we haven't seen strangers. Do you not see the dwellings we have? Do you not see what toil it is for us to go to church?" And all of a sudden that myth falls away. So here you are no longer in Ovid's land, but in a land that is in his contemporary world where people struggle to go to church. So she's now all of a sudden talking to him. I mean, equal would be the wrong term to use, but as somebody who is in the same landscape as he is, in the same infrastructural landscape, lived landscape, not the mythical edges of the medieval map. So thank you for that, Fury. That was a Fury from one of my favorite Greek poems, which is the world I usually live in. And they are the Reniers, is the other term for them. So these are the kind of deities of vengeance, if you like. So these stories are kind of lenses that fall away, but other ones come into place. And the ones that come into place are different myths, where then all of a sudden Linnaeus is the protagonist. And that's where I'm going to turn back to Staffan.
Okay, yes. So what you see here, it's difficult with free computers. What you see here are some of the pictures we took while tracking that journey into the swamps of Luxile, where Linnaeus meets his Furia. It very nicely highlights the importance of hospitability. So a situation also in this case, a turn sort of from the hostile to the very welcoming and hospitable, where you have the full range of meanings there. So we redid this trip, met a lot of people on the way, and what became clear very quickly was that this landscape today is completely inscribed, not very surprisingly, but completely inscribed by the work of local historians that create a kind of living memory of Linnaeus's trip. But not only of Linnaeus's trip. So in a way, you can be guided today by slightly different means. So this is allegedly exactly the spot where Linnaeus was stuck in the swamps. And one can actually, you will see in a minute, reconstruct that quite precisely, and it gives you a number to ring. And that's the number of the person who put up this plaque at quite a lot of private costs. These are bottom-up initiatives. It's not the kind of 300 anniversary top-down state initiative. These are bottom-up initiatives. Now, one of the things. Oh, sorry. No. Not yet. We got ourselves also lost. We couldn't find this immediately, and as you see, we had our help ourselves from a local person there. We also learned from a local historian, Gudrun Orstedt, that she had been able to identify the Furia by name and birth date. So this was Katharina Pettersdotter, born 1678. And you can do that because there were tax records already back then. And if you know where he went, which you can actually, on the basis of his travel diary, reconstruct quite precisely in the topography of the landscape, and you can identify who owned the land, and it was, lo and behold, a woman. Now I want to give a quick example of the kind of depth you can reach through such conversations and learning sort of on the spot. The subject of this is a parasitic fly that attacks reindeer. So its larvae lays its eggs on the back of reindeer, and its larvae cause these so-called warbles. It's the reindeer warble fly. And Linnaeus's travel diary is sort of dotted with, can you go to the next slide? With observations of this fly. Interestingly, these observations take on very different forms. So here is an example when he's in the mountains, the so-called highlands, the fells, where the Sami have their reindeer herds during summer. He's staying with the Sami, he's in the field, and the knowledge he produces here is very much interactive. It's on the spot, and it speaks of interactions with the Sami, not always very clear. But when he says, "I removed gnawing maggots from the swellings on a couple of the reindeer," one can easily conclude that he wouldn't have done that without the help of the owners of these animals. Yeah. But there are also long sections in which he gives detailed observations on the anatomy and the development of the fly, which really come in the journal at the point where he's staying not in the field, but with one of his hosts, the priest Eustabius, and as Lena already mentioned, his wife, Christina Roth, is today very well known for having had a detailed knowledge of Sami culture, knowing Sami, keeping reindeer herself, and she's left a living memory as well. Everybody in Kvikjo still knows her today. And we've, on that basis, I skipped one slide, we've written this, skip to the next one. Well, maybe just to mention, if you go back.
Well, we're at time, so.
Oh, we're out of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe some 1 minute. One more.
Yeah. So do you want to conclude, Lena?
Okay, so basically, this is just very quickly. So one of the things we did is we went for about a 10-day journey to meet a reindeer herder, but also somebody who's doing a doctorate in linguistics and technological use of and education of languages, Katarina Koskinen, who was up in precisely some of these areas that Linnaeus went into Norway. And we took one route up, which was following the contemporary route, where there were lots of guides, where there were a lot of some huts, although we ended up staying mostly in tents. So we had a lot of conversations around where Linnaeus may have gone, what is known about Linnaeus, and the kind of things that Staffan showed you earlier about local interest in Linnaeus. And we met with Katarina, we can talk about that in questions or afterwards. But what's interesting is on the way back, through some of the knowledge that we gained on the way there, we took the track that Linnaeus would have taken, which is not at all marked, except by very ancient stones. For 3 days, we saw maybe 2 people. It was very arctic, a very different kind of landscape, very harsh kind of landscape. And what was amazing in this kind of retracking, what really came out to us and the importance of it, it's not necessarily, I mean, the precise route was interesting, but we gained much more of an understanding, particularly about guides and the importance of guides and the conversations en route by doing the walk there rather than the walk back. Although obviously the landscape was something that's technically much more what Linnaeus would have been in. So I think one of the things we asked ourselves is what kind of histories are we getting into when we're getting into there? This is a book some of you might know about, which is about the displacements in the 1920s. And the person who met the herder, her family was displaced into this area because the boundaries became very hard and people couldn't herd their reindeer between Sweden and Norway. And in doing so, they came across Sami that were doing very different kind of herding at that early time. So she talked to us about that. So the question for us is that landscape that we walk into, is it Linnaeus's landscape and that of the Swedish imperial powers at the time? Is it the landscape of Katarina Koskinen's family or the predecessors that were there before? Is it the landscape of the current tourists that we walk into? So there are all these kind of histories that intersect in that landscape that's there. So when we talk about retracking, that's the kind of thing we talk about. And I guess that's our website. I think that's it. And our funders.
Thank you. Well, it was incredible. It was very interesting. I wonder if I could make a slight adjustment so that we can ensure that we have the last talk presented as well. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind going, and then we can collect a couple questions at the very end for both of your papers. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. All right. Our last speaker today is Joseph Wachelder from Maastricht University. He will be speaking on phenomenon in transit, philosophical types and tools.
Thank you. Great. Just one second. Sorry. Make sure it's in the screen, and then see it. All right, should be good. Thank you. So I have to press the here. This doesn't work. Oh yeah, now it works. Yeah. Welcome. I would like to start on the personal note. We are ending the conference on circulation of knowledge 20 years on, and actually I'm concluding a project which also started 20 years ago, and I hadn't hoped and didn't expect that it would take so long, but it was inspired by James Seeker's paper Knowledge on Transit, and I was particularly fascinated by the idea considering science as communication, and particularly also not only considering conveying the truth, but also the misunderstanding. So I was really, I prefer the idea of transit above circulation, because as James mentioned, it in each communication, there is also something which can change or may change. However, if we focus on knowledge, knowledge might be a very complicated unit of analysis, and it all depends, of course, what you want to research and what you're interested in. I was particularly challenged to find out whether it would be possible to apply this idea or this model of knowledge in transit to study the highly transformative period around 1800 in the sciences. And then the idea is that knowledge might not be that easy to define, because in this transformative period, it's not only the contents which change, it's actually the mediators which change, it's the institutions which change. So what considers knowledge, and how does this work as a unit of analysis if you want to get deeper into the understanding of what is happening there? Although, on the other hand, if you look to considering how people define or actually analyze what's happening in this transformative period, it's very much defined by actually the outcome. It's professionalization, disciplinization, all these kind of things. So that brought to me the idea, would it be possible to define a very, very tiny unit of analysis, a phenomenon, which you can follow over a longer period, and particularly over this transformative period. And the unit of analysis of phenomenon is neither obvious nor unproblematic. Because how do we have access to phenomena? I operationalize this by turning to Michael Baxendale's methodology in patterns of intention. And I don't know whether you're familiar with that. Baxendale is an art historian who works a lot in the intersection between art and science. And actually, he comes up with a very interesting proposal and says, hey, if we discuss paintings, we are not discussing paintings. We are actually discussing descriptions of paintings. So we should focus on descriptions of phenomena. And in that sense, one other element of his methodology is he reverses the arrow of influence. So it's not A, earlier in time influences B, later in time. No, we can speak only about influence if we can recognize that B recognizes the influence of A, and that there is a go-between. So that's that. You can also discuss this, but this was my idea to do. And I had the idea, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow a very, very tiny phenomenon over, and now it has become well under 50 years. I planned a shorter period, but it was necessary to do so. And I had a specific interest in transient phenomena. To some extent, also an analogy what Staffan did for the vacuum and the void. Is it possible to study actually the perception of transient phenomena, which in the 19th century would become actually known as after images? Is it possible to follow this over a long time period and actually study the transformations? There is, of course, after images are well known. After images is well known. You all know cinema, and you all know, most of you will know the principle of position of vision, and it is in about 1900 it was said that this actually is this as it is called the finiscoscope, philosophical toy, demonstrated actually moving pictures when you look through a slit and a moving disc. With a picture behind it, behind this mirror, you look to it and then you see moving pictures. And in that sense, it was these philosophical toys are traditionally always connected to the, let's say, the discovery of positions of vision. Here there is a disc made by Joseph Dettel, one of the inventors of the finiscoscope. And of course, there is an extensive historiography on this type of toys. As I mentioned, it is considered a precursor of cinema, which is a very technological determinist histories. There are large debates on who was the real inventor, and I don't know whether you're familiar with, most of you, some of you may be familiar with the Jonathan Quarry's book, Technique of the Observer, which is very, very popular in cultural studies and in vision studies. And actually he makes the finiscoscope with the stereoscope actually as the exemplifying exemplifying the episteme of modernity. Although in queries analysis, science doesn't play a role at all. It does play a role for Nicholas Waite in his analysis of, for instance, how Bruce and Wheatstone engaged in vision studies in the 1830s. But there, it's very much focusing on the 1830s without taking the long period, which I try to do. Here, I would like to start with my general conclusions. I mentioned that I'm rounding up a project which I worked for on a number of years. I won't go into specific case studies. I'm just sharing my overall conclusions. I will give 5 of them, and then in the remaining time, I will elucidate the one after the other, how long time is available. And I would argue that this period of philosophical ties, that actually this phenakistoscope, etc., is actually understudied. Although there are many approaches to it, many publications, but it's still understudied. And there are five observations which I draw from my long-term analysis. And the first is that this phenakistoscope was a philosophical tie, but at the meantime, it opened a new experimental approach to the study of after images. This, including new concepts and new models. So that's one. It was really a radical break. Working with disks was something, with apertures was something new. The second general conclusion is that philosophical ties establish a tight connection between science and education. And there is an ongoing consumer culture which actually feeds and drives these gadgets. That is, these gadgets, this phenakistoscope, that it was that popular. It's very important to understand the emergence of a transnational field. That leads to the third general conclusion, that actually in this transformative period, the general popularity among the general public, and that is used by scholars, natural philosophers on the bench, is very actually here you see very direct and reciprocal interaction between what is going on in science and what is going on in popular culture. It actually influences each other. Then my fourth overall conclusion is that this type of ties created a very tight connection between play and experiment. And for all of us, the connection between play and experiment is something which is obvious. It has not always been there. So this connection that actually a child raising and playing is important to actually and informs education. That is something which is born in this time, and I will return to that later on. Then a last observation is that when I'm talking about that play experiences can actually inform later lives as a scientist, or can actually contribute to self-fashioning your life later on, retrospectively, that is something, a generational awareness, which I think that you can find in the 1860s and 1870s, whereas way less in each case in the beginning of the 19th century. So these are my 5 conclusions. And what I will do is, in the time that is given, I will actually elucidate one after the other, very much in short, and I won't go into detail. I mentioned that this phenakistoscope actually created a new approach to the study of vision with using light pulses. What is absolutely not true is that in the 1830s, persistence of vision was discovered. Most historians of science will immediately agree, but there are a lot of popular literature, and even the very popular and the very well-read and widely read book by Jonathan Crary suggests that it is an invention of the 1830s. which is simply not true. It was known in the Middle Ages. It was as of 1740, it was used as an argument. Duration of vision, as it was called then, it was used as an argument, actually to promote or to actually to advocate a corpuscular perspective on light. However, this is only one perspective in natural philosophy. So there is one strand in the 18th century which deals with duration of vision in the context of theories of light. So there is, next to that, there is Buffon's accidental colors, and there is, on top of that, a very important and a very influential publication by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, on ocular spectra, actually illusions in the eye, which actually in which he tried to advocate a theory or method of strong analogy, but actually which was received very widely and was also referenced till the mid of the 19th century. Plato. Plato was actually one of the inventors of the Phenakistoscope. He was also one person who came up with a new theory. He started from replicating Chevalier d'Arcy's experiments in the 18th century and came up with a new theory in 1834. And the interesting thing is that Plato was a Belgian, and this new theory was very much informed by Chevreul, the other theorist, and Ampère. And Ampère very much advocated to come up with phenomenal laws. Here I just give some pictures from the model which Plato suggests. There is no idea of a physiological explanation, but it's just a phenomenal law. What is interesting here is that Plato refers to Chevreul, Chevreul refers to Plato in 1828. If you look at the history of art history, then there is an enormous historiography on Chevreul's and simultaneous contrast. There is an enormous literature on vision studies, whereas actually they start very much in the 1828 they come together and then starting diverging. Then the other point, and that is these philosophical thoughts. On the one hand, the first one is that this considers, I would say, vision studies itself. It also creates a very tight connection between education and science. And this whole idea of philosophical thought, in my view, is very popular in a very short period in the late 1820s, 1830s, and it very much builds on Bellows and the Edgeworth's rational thoughts. So actually, and practical education, where the idea is give people toys which they can use, which they can have in their hand. So not just visual, just that they can experiment with. And John Paris, philosophy and sport, I guess that he has a very, very important role in he is considered one of the inventors of the thaumatrope, had a very important role in coming up with this, tightening this connection between education and science. Then the third observation, there is Plato wrote in French, but then at this moment in 1828, his publications were immediately translated, or in 1830 were immediately translated into Philosophical Magazine in English and in Parlement des Annales in German. So that was one way that this theory became actually something to react on. On the other hand, the popularity of these transnational gadgets, they came from London, were imitated in London by 6 or 7 producers, went within 3 weeks to London, to Paris, and then to Vienna. So this popularity in the consumer culture, which was interested in gadgets, was extreme, which in my view very much contributed to the actually establishment of an international field. And once again, here's a reciprocity between, let's say, what's going on in popular culture and what is going on in the lab. Rather immediately, Bruce starts working with perforated disc to come up with, as he called it, a new property of light. Just that light pulses have a different approach to have a different result than just continuous lightning. I will conclude. My next slide is that toys are there to stay, and then I refer to the 1860s, where all kind of amateur instruments were offered, but also, and then I return to that's maybe that I would like to conclude with this. No, I will first go to that. You know James Maxwell. So in the 1860s, James Maxwell is using new rotating discs for color, for quantitative analysis of colors. It is immediately Maxwell in his first biography is painted down as someone who would actually use the phenascoscope or work on one. I will conclude with this slide. When I would be asked or challenged to summarize my findings as regards to relationship between science and popular culture in 3 words, I would return to Chapin's model for 17th century experiments, trying, testing, and demonstrating. I would suggest that was the 19th century exploring, Faraday's exploratory research, as Stanley mentioned it, and illustrating are actually exchanged for demonstrating and exploring. And the key thing is, and then I conclude, is that in the periphery of play, illustration can become exploration. So there it's the illustration. If you go to the periphery of play, this can also be something which can be interpreted as exploring. Yeah.
You guys don't mind me saying it, so that we can ask a couple of questions. So the floor is open for both the second and the third papers.
It's a very quick one. Does the hospitality ever break down?
Yes. Yes. So I mentioned these 2 situations roughly that we find in Linnaeus that we talked about in our paper, at the table and in the field. So at the table, at his hosts and priestly homes, he gets all these, his hosts know about the Sami, it's present, it's in the anthropological present, these accounts, and he just writes it down faithfully. The third situation we explore is when he's in Finland, where communication breaks down because of linguistic issues and a certain atmosphere of hostility between the Swedish and the Finns as a result of the Great Nordic War. And that's where he's actually, first of all, has very little to say. There are whole days where he only has one observation. And second, where he also describes the Finns in a kind of distanced manner that is almost like physical anthropology. So he calls them children of darkness. Which our Finnish hosts always very much enjoy. They fully subscribe to that characterization.
So perhaps your questions around whether when there is hospitality, whether that breaks down.
Well, it could be, I was just posing it generally because I did work on Scots in British India, and there were very interesting forms of resistance, hospitality breaking down, even if you came with a letter from the government, which is associated with forced labor. They would just lay down the goods and run away.
Yeah.
Well, I have an example, a little bit like that.
Yeah, there are examples of that as well. So it's in the mountains. One guy in particular apparently gets bored, or well, he basically doesn't want to serve as a guide anymore, and that lost without impact. So as methods to try to keep. But there are situations like that as well, yes.
Other questions for Joseph?
This is for Joseph. I want to ask you about the category of philosophical toy versus actors categories, because philosophical toy is a kind of general and quite loaded category, but I don't know whether your actors thought of them and conceptualized them or categorized them on that term at the time. And if not, how did they conceptualize these devices? Because in one place they might be experimental tools, and in another place they might be a toy.
It's for me as an actors category. It's a very good question because actually also the category of a phenomenon can be an actors category and an editor category. The concept of philosophical toy is for me a complete actors category, and it's particularly connected how they are advertised, how they are promoted.
Sure.
So it's just how they are advertised. So that's the main thing. And if, for instance, in John Farrell's philosophy talk, if there is people talk about philosophical toys, that's a complete actors category. Although you're right, let's say it's a strange combination, at least for us, of a philosophical toy might signal some kind of hybrid, which actually affords change. So in that sense, you can interpret it in that way, and I do interpret it.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming in. Today was a wonderful, very rich and fruitful set of papers. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.